Good afternoon. My name is Michael Redaway, and I'm a student at Tiffin University. My speech is going to be on the Napoleonic era of the early 1800s. I'm going to introduce you to my audience right now, and then we'll get started. Okay, let's begin. The Napoleonic era is one of the most important eras in history. This saw the rise and fall of France. It saw the rise of the first dictatorship in a major European power, one that we had never seen before. Historically, it was always monarchies that ruled Europe until a guy named the little corporal, a guy named Napoleon Bonaparte came along. The Napoleonic era started in 1799 and it went all the way to 1815, culminating with Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo. We're going to look at some of the major impact players from this era, look at some strengths and some weaknesses, and the abilities of how this era impacted the world today. This era is majorly forgotten by most historians, and most historians don't like to talk about this era because this era can be controversial. That being said, let's go ahead and get into it. The Napoleonic era, the first was based off of Napoleon Bonaparte. The first leader that we're going to talk about from the Napoleonic era, however, is Thomas Jefferson of America. President Jefferson made a deal with Napoleon Bonaparte for the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Territory stretched from west of the Mississippi all the way to California. Now, California was still owned by Spain, as well as New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas was its own country at this point in time. But pretty much every state from the Central Time Zone, the Mountain West Time Zone, were all part of the Louisiana Purchase. The purchase costed $120 million, and Thomas Jefferson was known as a shrewd diplomat, had Napoleon at a great disadvantage, and that disadvantage resulted in the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon was fighting against pretty much everybody in Europe at this point in time. Thomas Jefferson, knowing this, told his constituents, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he basically had Napoleon at a huge disadvantage. Now, rather than going and having tried to fight Napoleon for the territory, he said, let's make him an offer. Napoleon, realizing that he doesn't have the army and the resources to fight America at this point for the territory, and also realizing that Spain was dominating Mexico, as well as other parts of what we now know as America, as the southwest part of the nation, realized, why not use America and allow them to purchase the Louisiana Territory, and then let them and Spain fight it over. With a impending Spanish-American War, now I don't have to worry about Spain. This is Napoleon's thinking. I don't have to worry about Spain throwing everything they got at me, because they're going to want that territory from America. And this is going to result in conflict over there, which now helps me, as well as the fact that I can make money off of this purchase. This is money that was Napoleon badly needed to pay his men, to pay for weaponry, to pay for cannon fire and rifles and gunpowder. None of this stuff is cheap, especially when you're buying at such a bulk rate like Napoleon was fighting to supply his armies. Thomas Jefferson, one of his greatest strengths was also one of his greatest weaknesses, because while he was a shrewd diplomat, he was also someone that didn't mind doing business with the first major dictator in Europe's history. I know that Napoleon crowned himself as Emperor of France, but that was after he was already first consul of France, and then he got rid of the other two consuls and wrote the Napoleonic Code. Napoleon's greatest contribution to the human race might have been the Napoleonic Code. The Napoleonic Code is still the it's still the constitution, the basis of the constitution of every major country in Latin America, as well as France, all written by the first dictator in European history. Napoleon's greatest strength was that he was probably the greatest general of all time. If he wasn't the greatest general of all time, he was definitely the greatest strategist and greatest general of his era. He was known as the first modern general. The reason why was because when people would fight, typically in those days in Europe, you gave the gentleman a way out. Essentially, if the army was going to be destroyed and there was one way out, most of the time during wars, men were allowed to escape, especially the leadership, especially the generals. Napoleon took that away. He wanted total and utter victory, total domination. As a result, this made a lot of enemies. This resulted in him decimating people. The ideas of flanking and maneuvering are still hold true today and are still taught at West Point. Napoleon's strategies were so far ahead of their time that his enemies eventually studied them and copied them and used them to their gain. This era impacted also the development of firearms. Because of the Napoleonic era, we saw weapons that went from this and this to becoming, by 1860, just a mere 45 years after, look like this and this. Basically, the Napoleonic era is an era that, while some historians would like to forget, is actually it was very important part of history. And while it only lasted 16 years, it can't be understated the impact of guys like Thomas Jefferson and Napoleon Bonaparte having on history today. I'm Michael Redaway. Thank you for listening.